Wolf woke up feeling unbearably warm but entirely unwilling to move. On his left, Ella's short blue hair framed the slender curve of her body, mostly hidden beneath her Academy-issued pajamas. On his right, Cassie's long brown hair brushed his thigh as she used him as a body pillow, her leg locked around his. The fan whirred in the background, but none of its cool air reached him. The blanket had long been discarded, leaving only a thin sheet. The clock read 6:55, giving him only a few minutes to enjoy the morning's cozy situation before the alarm went off. Both witches' auras were noticeably stronger and more stable, a change Wolf attributed to their recent bond exercises. He also felt stronger himself, which surprised him. If he had been balancing their growth with his own mana, why was he feeling such a noticeable boost? The answer might be in the inheritance, if only he could figure out how to extract it. He studied the rune-covered inscription floating before him. Magi bloodline 3%. Lightning affinity low. Fire affinity low. Gravity affinity low. Other elements locked. Bonded which Ella Mariel. Bonded which Cassie Noxus. Bond ability fast travel. The percentages were rough guesses based on the partially filled runes, but it was more information than he had before. The inheritance's spell was multi-layered and too complex to fully read, even with magnification. Magical inscriptions couldn't be photographed or mirrored, they only revealed themselves to his eyes. Wolf had made a noticeable jump in his mana capacity over the last day, though the bloodline effects were still vague. Unlocking other elements, like wind, could help disperse the current heat in the room. He tested gravity manipulation, focusing on the fan's oscillation button. The fan shuddered under his spell, but wouldn't budge. He realized he'd been pushing instead of pulling. Adjusting his intent, the button rose, and the fan began spinning just as the alarm went off. Good morning, Ella mumbled, sitting up. Good morning, Wolf replied. I forgot where I was. Shower first, you wake Cassie. Ella apologized, darting to the bathroom. Are you up? If not, I'll have to kiss you awake. Wolf teased Cassie, who scrunched her eyes shut. He cradled her head gently, pressing a soft kiss to her lips, then to her nose, which earned her a sneeze. Their playfulness was cut short as Ella returned, wrapped in a towel. Will you two stop making out? Time for breakfast, she reminded them. Wolf grumbled good-naturedly and followed her lead to the showers. He returned in time to help Cassie braid her hair and assist Ella in finding her tights, left forgotten in a bag under her bed. At breakfast, Wolf noticed why the cafeteria was so large. From the second year onward, practical training meant bringing familiars to class. Some witches didn't need them, but most relied on their presence, which created a chaotic room full of small animals, and a few oversized exceptions like Flame and Wolf. You familiar guy? Make this creature behave, Krista Abilene demanded, dragging a goblin by its long green ear. Dude, what's your problem? Wolf asked, whispering to the clearly frustrated goblin. Humans are different. Blend in. Dress nice. Once she forgets you're a goblin, you can make your move and keep her happy forever. The goblin cheered, washed off in soap bubbles, and returned wearing a makeshift toga fashioned from a tablecloth, standing politely beside his witch. Krista's friends gawked. You speak goblin or something? How long will that last? As long as needed. Treat him well, keep him civil, Wolf assured her. Risa leaned in, whispering. Her parents are senior government ministers. Don't cause trouble. Not at all. I told him to behave until graduation, and he gets what goblins want, Wolf replied. Risa silently mouthed, You're evil, before joining her friends for breakfast. Wolf's gaze drifted to the students preparing for potion class. First years rarely brought familiars, but Krista's goblin explained her need. Ella joked, Ready to be our personal porter this morning? It's my handsome face, isn't it? Can't bear to be away from me. Wolf teased. Cassie chimed in, laughing. Beautification potions are first lessons. We'll have you stunning in no time. Maybe that's the missing 3% compatibility. After breakfast, the first years headed to the basement for lab work. Professor Ashcroft waited, giving Wolf a look of pity. I didn't expect to see you again before a proper investigation, she whispered. Oh, I've got it pretty good, Wolf replied, confusing her. I've seen magi familiars before. Drawing mana from men accused of using magic is usually excruciating. Even with good compatibility, it often drives them to suicide within years, she whispered. Wolf shook his head. If they exceed my capacity, yes. Otherwise, They take only what I can give. The professor nodded thoughtfully. Interesting. Perhaps magi were weak demons mixing with humans to survive. But lower classes need strong familiars for potion activation. Mary and Pup would have worked, but he bit the first suggestion. Ella and Cassie exchanged knowing looks. So he'll force mana through the regular class witches? Ella asked. Exactly. They should learn the hard way. Cassie agreed. Wolf, help the other class, but no more than one finger. Sanitize afterward. Ella and Cassie instructed, making Professor Ashcroft chuckle. Wolf entered the adjacent classroom, waving to the teacher. And who are you? Wolf, volunteer familiar from Class A, instructed not to use more than a single finger for potion activation. A humanoid familiar? Very well. I'll show them the basic healing potion, common colds, cuts, bruises. Easy. The process was simple. Add ingredients, stir with aura, then infuse mana until the potion changed color. Wolf only needed to push a minuscule amount of mana, enough to warm the students' bodies and guide their magic without overwhelming them. The first few students struggled. Their internal mana mechanisms were underdeveloped, causing incomplete potion activation. Wolf pushed a little extra mana to help stabilize the brew, watching pride and joy bloom in their eyes. This class is fun, Wolf thought. They were still developing, yet intelligent and eager. Watching their first successes reminded him why familiars were known to tease their witches. After helping all 100 students, Wolf understood why teenage witches were so adored. Thank you, Wolf. That's all. Back to your witch while the class works on herbalism, the teacher ordered. Some potions failed, but they still represented progress. Wolf smiled. It had been exhausting, but immensely satisfying. Afternoon classes were a welcome change, shifting from theory to practical spell skills. We found ourselves on a grassy field, dotted with little red flowers, each of us sitting inside a protective circle drawn on the ground. Today's lesson? Flame armor. It was a defensive spell, meant to create a barrier of magical fire. As I sat down, I could feel the circle humming with energy. It was like a live wire under my fingertips. Before the teacher even finished her explanation, a strange certainty washed over me. I knew I could cast this spell. Focus, I whispered. Feel the energy, just like the teacher said. Sitting between Ella and Cassie, an idea sparked. I reached out and took their hands. As we concentrated together, the spell burst to life, not just around me, but around all three of us. A glowing orange shell, warm and bright, enveloped us in a shared barrier. This was a game changer. It wasn't just about me learning spells anymore. I could actually share them, teach them to combat-ready witches just by touching them. The possibilities were staggering. My excitement, however, was interrupted by a tiny, frustrated noise. I looked down and saw Flame, my little fire element lizard familiar, pacing back and forth, looking utterly bored. He already knew this stuff. I glanced over at Reiko, who was struggling a bit with the incantation. Reiko, I called out. Pick up Flame. He knows the spell. He can show you. She looked confused, but did as I said. The moment her fingers brushed against Flame's scaly skin, a faint orange glow flickered to life around her. It was weak at first, but it was there. She was doing it. Our teacher, who had been observing us, nodded in approval. Trust your familiars, she announced to the class. They aren't just pets. They are an extension of your own magical potential. They are essential to your growth as a witch or warlock. She was right. Flame wasn't just a companion. He was a conduit, a teacher in his own right. After class, the teacher asked the three of us, me, Ella, and Cassie, to stay behind. I thought we might be in trouble for linking our spells, but her expression wasn't angry. Once the other students had cleared out, she looked at me with a serious but not unkind gaze. Wolf, she said, your familiar is powerful and clearly intelligent, but he also gets bored easily. You need to find a way to keep him engaged, or he's going to disrupt the entire class. Her words stuck with me. A bored familiar was a mischievous familiar. I needed a plan. That evening, I headed straight for the school's massive library. The place was incredible, with shelves that seemed to stretch up into the heavens, filled with ancient books. The librarian, a calm, knowing witch with spectacles perched on her nose, looked up as I approached. A flicker of recognition crossed her face. Oh, it's you, she said, a small smile playing on her lips. Word travels fast. Everyone's been talking about the two first-year students who summoned the same familiar. I felt a little embarrassed, but pushed on. I need some study guides for the upcoming exams, I said. And also, an adventurous spellbook. Something to keep my familiar occupied. Her smile widened. She led me down a winding aisle and pulled out two thin books. These are the best study guides, she said. Then, she pointed to a much larger volume on a lower shelf. As for adventure, I recommend the Adventurer's Handbook. It was a massive, 1,000-page tome bound in worn leather. Perfect. Back in the dorm, I proudly displayed my haul. Study guides for the exams, I announced, handing one to Reiko and Mary and the other to Cassie and Ella. They looked grateful. Then, I held up the giant book. And what's that big codex? Ella asked, eyeing it curiously. Oh, this, I said, trying to sound casual. Just some light reading material for class. Later that night, as I settled onto the couch between Ella and Cassie to start reading, Mary looked over from her desk. She had a thoughtful expression on her face. Wolf, she started, I have to ask, what is it with you and familiars? It's not just flame. They all seem to understand you, like you speak their language. I just shrugged, a small smile playing on my lips. It was a long story, and honestly, I was still figuring it out myself. For now, I was just happy to have my friends, my familiars, and a whole world of magic to explore. After hours of late-night practice, the group proved something important. Learning together was far more effective than struggling alone in class. With Wolf guiding them and Flame reinforcing their understanding, the witches improved at an incredible pace. They quickly discovered that flame armor wasn't limited to a single form. It didn't have to glow orange, nor did it have to surround the body like a barrier. With proper visualization, it could become a faint heat haze, solid armor, or even clothing-like layers. The only constant was its nature, solidified flame. But experimentation had its limits. After hours of constant mana use, exhaustion set in. Everyone was drained, physically and mentally, so they decided to call it a night. Breakfast plans were made, along with a detour to the library before potions class. That night, Wolf made sure the room was comfortable, especially the fan. A small detail, but one that mattered. By morning, Ella pointed out the obvious. Instead of walking back and forth between dorms, Wolf might as well move in permanently. He didn't argue. With his belongings packed into a laundry sack, Wolf stepped into the hallway, only to be stopped by a janitor with an amused look. She informed him casually that Coven investigators had arrived. They were looking for him. Apparently, his empty room had raised questions. But with his scent mixed thoroughly into the academy and heavily saturated with witch magic, the mystery of his location was already solved. Worse, the investigators were already speaking with Ella and Cassie, and what they were saying was terrifying. The investigator calmly explained that Wolf wasn't considered human anymore. He was classified as a Class A threat, something that would eventually lose control and become dangerous. Execution had been considered, but because Wolf was already bound as a familiar, the sentence was reduced. Instead, they would drain his mana, brand him with a transformation mark, curse him, and permanently strip him of his humanity, turning him into a demonized familiar incapable of harming others. Ella and Cassie were horrified, but refusing wasn't an option. Defending a condemned being was a serious crime, and the investigator made it clear the decision had already been finalized. When Wolf returned to the dorm moments later, guards blocked the door. The moment he identified himself, blades were drawn. He was escorted inside. The ritual began immediately. Ella and Cassie were forced to drain Wolf's mana using enchanted devices, far more than his body could safely endure. The pain was overwhelming, enough to drive him to his knees as black fog filled the room. A burning brand pressed into his arm. And then, darkness. When Wolf awoke, the fog was clearing. The investigator was smiling, and both witches were crying. His sentence had already been carried out. The investigator declared him eternally banished from all Coven cities and sentenced him to a lifetime of service as a familiar. Then came the final command. He was ordered to choose his true name. The moment Wolf remembered it, his full, unrecorded name, a red light erupted through the room. The curse reacted, not with decay, but with awakening. Demonic bloodline unlocked. Unholy element activated. New spell acquired. And yet, Wolf remained human. That alone shocked everyone. Even the headmistress, who had been silently observing from the shadows, stepped forward in disbelief. The curse was meant to warp criminals into monstrous forms. But Wolf hadn't changed. That could only mean one thing. His heart hadn't been corrupted. To test the curse's effects, Wolf attempted to use his newly gained spell, Unholy Smite. Moments later, screams echoed across the academy. Outside, the investigators' transport vehicle burned under white-hot flames that refused to extinguish. The headmistress acted quickly, containing the destruction. Then she laughed. The spell had only affected the investigator because the magic judged her intent as malicious. Wolf had unintentionally passed judgment on his judge. From that moment on, the truth became clear. The curse hadn't weakened him. It had empowered him, but at a terrible cost. Wolf was now permanently barred from entering Coven-controlled cities. His future, and the future of the witches bound to him, would have to exist beyond civilization's walls. Yet despite everything, he was still allowed to stay at the academy, still allowed to learn, still allowed to protect them. As breakfast approached and the group reunited in the cafeteria, Wolf explained the official version of events. He was a familiar now, banished, but not broken. And as he smiled at the girls beside him, one thing was certain. This wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. As usual, the first-year witches spent their morning in potions class. But this time, Wolf came prepared. He had a good book, plenty of time, and more importantly, a plan. Yesterday, he had secretly infused a few students with extra mana. Before lunch, he'd already sensed their auras beginning to form. Today, he wanted proof that his experiment had worked. When Professor Ashcroft sent him to assist the B through D classes, the potions instructor greeted him politely, very different from her earlier cold attitude. Today's lesson? Beautifying potions. Normally, they would start next week, but after the investigators' dramatic vehicle incident, students had become nervous about burns and scars. So, beauty potions were moved up in the schedule. Fear was a powerful motivator. Wolf hid a smile when the professor mentioned how the Academy's wards had reacted strongly to evil intent. The reminder alone made half the class panic and rethink every bad thought they'd ever had. With that, the brewing began. Students lined up for mana assistance. The beautification potion required significantly more energy than yesterday's healing draft. When the first student called him over, Wolf placed a finger gently at the back of her neck and transferred mana. He focused carefully, not on the reaction this time, but on what was happening internally. There it was, a cluster of nerves in the chest, just above the solar plexus. That was the origin of a witch's aura. The mana had to pass through that point. Some students had a well-developed connection. Others didn't. As each talented witch completed her potion, Wolf quietly strengthened her aura with a bit of extra mana. Subtle improvements. Long-term benefits. Then he reached one of the students who couldn't use mana at all. The nerve cluster was present, but dormant. The pathway between the mana intake and the aura center was damaged or undeveloped. So Wolf did something risky. He carefully forced mana across the gap, bridging the broken connection. It took nearly 5 minutes, but the potion activated. The girl trembled, overwhelmed, but successful. The professor noticed. Then another student. Same issue. Wolf reinforced the connection again, this time welding the nerve endpoints together. The effect was stronger. She nearly collapsed from the intensity. That's when the professor stepped in. You've had enough fun. From then on, Wolf had to assist more passively, feeding mana into the endpoint rather than personally guiding it through their systems. Still effective, just less entertaining. When he returned to Class A, he was greeted with teasing. Apparently, word had spread. "Goddess, please don't stop," someone mimicked dramatically, sending the class into laughter. Professor Ashcroft silenced them, but the envious glances toward Ella and Cassie didn't go unnoticed. Cassie leaned over. "You remembered our orders, right?" One finger. Back of the neck. "No more," Wolf replied innocently, while subtly transferring her a bit of mana anyway. She huffed and returned to her work. With little to do in theory class, Wolf opened the Adventurer's Handbook. The first spell, Spark. A simple ignition spell. He memorized the circle mentally, refining it until the inheritance rune confirmed. Spell learned, Spark. Next came Create Water. No matter how perfectly he visualized it, it wouldn't activate. Water wasn't one of his unlocked elements. The inheritance refused to budge. Then he found Gentle Steps, a gravity spell allowing silent movement across unstable terrain. Now that one worked. It was more complex than spark. The circle was simple, but the activation nuance was precise. It took him the rest of the morning, and most of lunch, to master it. Gravity came easier to him than water. But strangely, unholy magic still felt like the strongest affinity. Unfortunately, asking openly for demon spellbooks would raise questions. He'd need subtlety. After lunch, Class A returned to the grass-floored training room. But the hallway was crowded. A group of upperclassmen waited outside, whispering excitedly. Is it true? Did those two first years summon an incubus? Ella immediately shot back. You can't have our familiar. The professor smirked. There's no proof he's a demon of any sort. The betting pool remains open. The upperclassmen laughed and retreated, leaving rumors swirling behind them. Cassie, however, wasn't laughing. The investigator had said Wolf would transform according to his nature. If he hadn't changed at all, what did that mean? Was he something like an incubus? No one really knew what one looked like. Only that they were said to be irresistibly attractive to witches. Cassie wasn't sure if that was comforting or terrifying. Let's see who has improved flame armor, the professor announced. Students activated their spells. But something else caught Wolf's attention. The professor looked different. Younger, deep blue hair, golden eyes, radiant. Do professors usually get makeovers like that? Wolf asked casually. The dark blue really suits you. Silence. The professor froze. Then she turned to him slowly. In the future, if you happen to see through a glamour spell, keep your observations to yourself. Oh, it wasn't a potion. He had accidentally pierced her illusion. Reiko immediately leaned in. Wait, what was dark blue? The glare that followed could have melted stone. Wolf mimed locking his lips shut, but it was too late. Now every student in class was staring at their professor, wondering what else she might be hiding beneath glamour. And for the first time that day, Wolf realized something important. His vision had changed. He hadn't just gained power. He was seeing through lies. And that might be far more dangerous than any spell he could cast. Most of you still need work on flame armor, Professor Ashcroft announced as class ended. But Cassie, Ella, Reiko, and Mary, you may begin Flame Strike tomorrow. The rest were told to catch up, and soon the girls were already planning. Study meeting after dinner? Ella asked. Reiko nodded happily. Practice room. Flame Strike should be easy. Wolf watched quietly. This first week had really been his moment to shine, though he wondered if Reiko truly understood how to maximize a familiar's potential. Their bond still felt new. The practice halls were packed. Second and third-year witches filled every lane, casting toward shielded targets while discussing spell circles on whiteboards. The noise was overwhelming. Mana bursts, laughter, arguments over rune placement. Now that they were officially commoner witches, grades mattered. Future noble ranking depended on it. Wolf quickly realized he was the main attraction. Rumors had spread. He might be an incubus, a demon capable of boosting a witch's power through alternative meditation techniques. Ella and Cassie weren't thrilled about the attention. Once they found an empty lane, Ella turned serious. Today we practice remote mana collection. You stay outside the barrier. Cassie and I will draw mana through you. It was advanced bonding practice, useful for real combat scenarios. Flame Strike sat suspiciously far back in the spellbook. Oddly, Firebolt, which was much easier, appeared near the front. It's a teacher prank, whispered an imp familiar from the next lane. Overachievers suffer all night trying to learn the impossible spell. Just start with Firebolt. Wolf smirked. It would be funnier if I actually taught them Flame Strike. The imp grinned and tapped his head. A moment later spell learned, demonic Flame Strike. Wolf blinked. The spell that formed in his mind wasn't the one in the book. The runes weren't fire-aligned at all. This was something darker, unholy in nature, but mimicking fire. Interesting. Flame knows it, Wolf suggested. Reiko, let him demonstrate while sharing mana flow. Reiko stepped forward, holding her red lizard familiar. Flame stood dramatically on his hind legs, made exaggerated gestures, and flicked his tongue. A thin pillar of fire erupted at the target. I sensed it, Reiko said, though I was distracted by his dance. Her first attempt failed. Her second produced a weak column of fire. It's correct, the neighboring witch praised. Just needs more mana. Her imp added mischievously. If you could move mana like my witch, it would be impressive. Ella tilted her head. Would you demonstrate? The second-year witch gladly obliged, forming the spell slowly so everyone could observe. Her Flame Strike roared to life, thick and bright yellow, far hotter than Reiko's. The imp narrated dramatically. Size depends on mana. Heat depends on activation. Familiars are naturally better with their innate elements. Then he added, it would be stronger with a finger snap. That is not part of the spell, his witch snapped back. Ask the big guy. He uses fire. All eyes turned to Wolf. Wolf, prove him wrong, the senior challenged. If my witches allow it. Cassie crossed her arms. Can you even use Flame Strike? Never tried. He wrapped one arm around Cassie, taking her hand, and mirrored Flame's gestures. But what he activated wasn't Flame Strike. It was demonic Flame Strike. Mana surged violently through him, and through Ella and Cassie as well. The final activation drained nearly a quarter of his reserves. Snap! Bright white flames exploded at the end of the hall. Not large, but blindingly intense. The protective ward struggled for a moment before stabilizing the heat. Silence fell. I think the finger snap helps, Wolf said innocently. The second year witch stared. I've cast that spell 1,000 times. Cassie stepped in. That wasn't Flame Strike. I can sense his spell circle when we're touching. There were no fire runes. The imp rolled on the floor laughing. There's a better Flame Strike, the senior whispered. I don't know if it's better, Cassie admitted. But it's different. The witch glared at her familiar. You're paying for that. Then the mood shifted. Be careful, the senior warned quietly. Humanoid familiars are dangerous. 5 years ago, a senior summoned a winged demon. It wouldn't obey. The headmistress had to break the bond. Wolf felt the tension. Breaking a bond causes backlash, she continued. It can destroy a witch's aura. She failed out. That was no small matter. Stronger familiar meant stronger witch, but too much difference could ruin everything. Wolf's strong, Cassie said thoughtfully. But maybe it works because he's not angry about being summoned. The senior blinked. You're not mad. Wolf smiled lazily. I get 2 beautiful witches. Why would I complain? He kissed Cassie's forehead. She blushed instantly. Wolf, behave. Ella sighed as he pulled her into a hug too. The senior laughed despite herself. Flame, meanwhile, demanded attention from Reiko, who happily pet him. Even the lizard thinks you've got it too good, the imp muttered. Let's focus, Reiko said, bringing them back to practice. Cassie stepped into the barrier. We agreed. Remote mana draw. Wolf leaned back. Fine. Cassie focused. At first, Wolf felt only a faint tug, weak but real. Impressive for a first attempt. He gently widened the connection. The trickle became a steady stream. Cassie's aura filled quickly. She released the spell. A clean, narrow flame strike hit the target. The imp whistled. She'll be one of the strongest in the academy. His witch sighed. I train you, not the other way around. The imp complained loudly about never being allowed to have fun. Cassie exited the barrier, slightly winded. So, are you training me? Or am I training you? She asked Wolf. He pulled her into his lap. First, stamina training. One and done isn't my style. A passing witch misunderstood completely. Cardio helps spell casting, she said helpfully. Mana output is physically exhausting. I hit the gym twice a week. Wolf grinned. Good advice. The newcomer introduced herself. I'm Nor. That's Parker. We were roommates. She lowered her voice. So, has the bet been decided? Wolf shook his head, still debating. Demon, Fae, or Magi? Most eliminated Fae, Parker muttered. That's unfortunate, Wolf replied lightly. Nor narrowed her eyes. So you might be Fae? I'm not saying I'm not Fae. Parker groaned. See? Riddles and innuendo. Every time. The imp nodded solemnly. He's trouble. Wolf only smiled. Because whether demon, Fae, or something else entirely, he was evolving faster than anyone in that hall. And none of them had realized yet. The most dangerous thing about Wolf wasn't his fire. It was how easily he made everyone stronger. While the others talked, Ella focused on improving her mana draw rate, and Wolf quietly strengthened the pathway between them. It was easier this time. The improvement was small, but noticeable. Wolf wasn't sure if it was practice or something deeper. His Magi bloodline seemed to respond strongly to closeness. The more emotionally connected he felt to Ella and Cassie, the more naturally mana flowed between them. Physical proximity helped, yes, but affection strengthened the bond even more. When Cassie smiled up at him while sitting on his lap, Wolf felt the connection tighten slightly. The more he cared, the smoother the transfer became. He had also discovered something else. His mana storage improved every time it was emptied and refilled. At night, He usually drained it passively, which was why Ella felt that faint radiation from him while he slept. But if the witches actively pulled from it to refine their auras, it emptied faster, allowing him to cycle and condense his reserves more often. It was efficient, very efficient. Wolf leaned close to Cassie and whispered, "While we're here, draw mana and enhance your aura. It's the fastest way to improve." She looked suspicious at first, expecting a joke. But once she began channeling his stored mana to refine her aura, her focus became absolute. The process demanded concentration, and she quickly forgot everything else around her. Across the lane, Ella's flame strike now looked nearly identical to Cassie's. Even the second-year students were impressed. "That's exhausting," Ella declared after her cast, flopping across Wolf's lap and resting her head against Cassie's legs. "We might switch to Firebolt," Reiko laughed. "You two look like you're about to fall asleep." "Firebolt is fine," Wolf agreed. "Let them recover." Compared to Flame Strike, Firebolt was smooth and manageable. By the end of the session, everyone had achieved a solid grasp of the spell, thanks to the helpful seniors. They were ready for tomorrow. Getting back to the dorm was another matter. Both Ella and Cassie were completely drained. Wolf practically carried them upstairs. That night, the three shared a bed again, but instead of sleeping, they meditated. Both witches drew mana continuously from Wolf, refining and integrating it into their auras. This constant flow allowed him to repeatedly refill and condense his reserves. Hour by hour, the bond deepened. Wolf began sensing more than just surface reactions. Subtle emotional impressions brushed against his awareness. That was normal for familiar bonds, but it usually took time. By morning, he wasn't just letting them draw passively. He actively fed extra mana into the stream, accelerating the process. The side effects were distracting. "Wolf," Cassie whispered softly, nudging his hand away from wandering too far. "If you don't stop, I won't stay quiet." Before things escalated further, the alarm rang. Ella jolted upright, running a hand through her messy blue hair. "We're never getting proper meditation done like that," she sighed. Wolf, however, noticed something she hadn't. Her aura was denser than last night. Significantly, Ella headed to the shower first. 10 minutes, she mumbled. The moment she left, Wolf grinned at Cassie. Breakfast first. What followed left Cassie glowing by the time she headed for the shower. A moment later, Ella's voice echoed from inside. "It was you too, wasn't it? I felt that through the bond." Cassie only laughed. Bond level increased. That alone told Wolf everything he needed to know. They lost track of time. By the time the shower finished, they had completely missed breakfast. The three of them sprinted through the dorm halls with damp hair, drawing amused cheers from upperclassmen. "Whose first period?" Someone laughed. "Ashcroft," another answered knowingly. "They'd better have stamina." Professor Ashcroft tolerated many things. Tardiness was not one of them. At the final staircase, Wolf scooped both witches into his arms and charged down the hall. They crossed the classroom threshold just before the buzzer. Professor Ashcroft stepped out of the prep room, eyes sharp as ever. "Excellent work, Mr. Wolf," she said calmly. "Your leg strength is impressive. However, do try to ensure your witches eat before class. I would prefer not to have anyone fainting from hunger." The rest of class struggled not to laugh. "You may go assist the other lab." Wolf bowed lightly and left, while Cassie and Ella tried very hard to look innocent. But one thing was clear. Their bond had strengthened dramatically overnight. And with each passing day, they were advancing faster than anyone expected. Once Wolf reached the other lab and took his usual seat by the door, he checked the glowing runes of his inheritance. The last 24 hours had clearly paid off. His magi bloodline percentage increased, mana density grew, and his mana focus was significantly more complete. The gains were incredible. If this pace continued for even a few more days, they would be far ahead of the class. But one detail stood out most. Their familiar bond had leveled up. At this stage, bonded partners could sense each other's emotions when nearby. Strangely, Ella and Cassie seemed to feel each other even more strongly than they felt Wolf. Even from the next laboratory, separated by stone walls and protective wards, Wolf could sense their frustration while brewing potions, and occasional bursts of shared amusement. The connection was becoming intense. The regular class witches were improving. Those Wolf had helped awaken were now completing most potions without assistance. He was instead assigned to the students who couldn't use mana at all. For them, He forced mana gently through their systems so they could finish assignments. There was hope. If repeated long enough, this might allow them to successfully perform the familiar summoning later in the year. But Academy rules were strict. If a student failed to meet the required standard by year's end, they could not continue training. Something didn't add up. Each year, there should have been many new commoner witch families rising from the lower floors. But in the city, only 1 or 2 families were elevated annually. Where did the rest go? Wolf wasn't sure who would give him an honest answer. Perhaps Professor Ashcroft. No new auras awakened that day, despite his efforts. When class ended, students headed to lunch. Afterward, Class A returned to the practical skills room. Professor Miranda greeted them warmly and asked for a progress report. Reiko stepped forward proudly and, with her familiar flame's help, demonstrated a flame strike. A thin but dense pillar of fire formed at the target. Professor Miranda was impressed. Then she called on Ella. Ella stepped forward calmly. Wolf barely felt her mana draw, yet the resulting flame strike was thick and controlled. Next was Cassie. Her flame strike was no larger than Ella's, but far hotter. The room's temperature rose noticeably, yet Wolf knew they were both restraining themselves. Instead of stunned silence, the class reacted with envy. Wolf leaned back, disappointed. He had hoped for all, but perhaps it was better this way. After all, they were already advancing faster than anyone realized. And if their current growth rate continued, the Academy wouldn't just be impressed. It would be forced to reevaluate what it thought was possible. Krista Abilene folded her arms, clearly unimpressed. If they can learn it in one day because they have strong fire affinity, why are the rest of us forced to waste weeks on spells we'll never use? Professor Miranda didn't even blink. These are foundational spells. Every witch must understand offense and defense across multiple elements before leaving the Academy. Every element has strengths and weaknesses. If you rely on only one, even a simple wilderness trip could become fatal. This wasn't a new argument. It happened every year. Krista scoffed. Then why not let us start with our strongest elements? Or actual witch magic? Plant growth, healing, utility. The Academy already restricts our fashion and servants. Must we also waste time? The room went silent. Professor Miranda's tone sharpened slightly. You have a strong water affinity, correct? Have you been practicing outside of class? Of course, Krista replied smugly. I won't let inefficient teaching waste my year. Excellent. The professor smiled thinly. Then Cassie will demonstrate the next spell. With 5 minutes of study, she should be able to defend against your water attacks. The class murmured. Wolf stepped forward to study the next spell in the book. Lightning armor, followed by lightning bolt. It was almost identical to flame armor. Only the elemental focus changed. Simple. Cassie nodded once she understood. Wolf visualized the spell activating around her, guiding the formation while letting her handle the shaping. He avoided using wall sockets as elemental focus. No need to waste energy when visualization would suffice. The result? Stunning. Cassie had imagined a luminous blue ball gown, fabric shimmering with arcs of violet lightning. A flowing cape crackled behind her. She looked regal. Wolf actually took a step back. Krista, Professor Miranda said calmly. Enter the circle. Krista did, chin high, expression smug, and forgot one crucial detail. Water conducts electricity. She sent a powerful stream of water directly at Cassie's chest. The moment it struck, the backlash slammed Krista against the barrier. Gasps filled the room. Can anyone explain why that happened? The professor asked. Is lightning armor an attack spell? Someone guessed. Close. Because impure water conducts electricity better than air, another student offered. Precisely, Miranda nodded. Magical water counters fire, but mana-derived lightning travels through it. Lightning struggles against earth. Earth resists lightning. You need multiple elements to survive. Krista slowly stood, pride clearly wounded. And just like that, the entire class took training more seriously. But Wolf's mind wasn't on lightning. It was on patterns. Why was the entire first-year curriculum combat focused? In the cities, witch magic was mostly utility, healing, agriculture, crafting. Here, armor, attack spells, defense rotations. Something didn't add up. Wilderness reagent gathering didn't justify this level of combat emphasis. The Academy had military support nearby, unless they expected witches to fight. Often, Wolf decided he needed answers. After class, he leaned close to Ella. I'm going to ask Professor Ashcroft a few questions. I'll meet you at dinner. That's fine, Ella replied, still struggling with lightning armor. Unlike Cassie, lightning wasn't her strong affinity. Wolf jogged downstairs. As expected, Professor Ashcroft was cleaning her lab. Need assistance? Wolf asked casually. I discovered a problem. Close the door, she replied with a wink. The moment it shut, she cast privacy spells and turned to him. All right, ask. Wolf didn't hesitate. What happens to the extra witches who never return to the city? And why is the first-year spell book entirely combat-oriented? Professor Ashcroft sighed deeply. The war history you were taught is a lie. Silence filled the room. We did not win the war against the Magi. The humans didn't either. Nobody won. She continued. When the Magi were reduced to their final circle of archmage elders, they cast grand magic from the central mountain range. Their final act sank an entire continent to the southwest into the ocean. The strongest human nations were wiped out. That created what we now call the Demon Sea. Wolf listened carefully. The war damage before that. Manageable. Nature magic healed battlefields. Even the bombs weren't catastrophic. But the final spell? Over 90% of the world's population died. Wolf felt his stomach tighten. And the Coven elders? He asked. They damaged their own bloodlines using forbidden magic to stabilize the world. That's why witch bloodlines grow weaker each generation. That answered one question. But not all. What about the humans? Wolf asked. They blamed us. Some joined the fortress cities. Others built nations in the north and east, places where witches are forbidden. So we're not at war. Not officially. But peace is fragile. Territory conflicts never truly stop. She continued. The three largest covens hold nearly half the continent, forming a ring around the frozen wastes of the central mountains. That area remains cursed. Monsters, undead, lingering warm magic. That's where many witches go. To explore. To settle new land. To join the Coven Guard. And the cities? Wolf asked quietly. There's an enchantment on the fortress walls. No one can speak of what lies beyond, even if they try. So the commoners lived in ignorance. They send promising girls to the academy, Ashcroft said softly. And if they survive the first year, we tell them the truth. Wolf leaned back. How much territory do witches actually control? Nearly half the continent, she replied. We are near the ocean and are relatively safe. But the deeper wilderness is still dangerous. She looked at him carefully. You understand you will never be considered equal by the Coven, correct? Wolf already knew. Returning to the city was impossible. So wilderness missions? He asked. Just preparation? Resources? She corrected. Potions. Reagents. Elemental foci. As spells advance, they require increasingly specific materials. Raw elemental bolts and armor are the only things manageable without strong foci. Wolf blinked. We cast flame strike without anything. She gave him a knowing look. With a fire elemental familiar and a demon familiar skilled in fire magic. Everyone else in that room had talismans in their pockets. That made sense. Krista would not enjoy that revelation. When do students learn to make talismans? Wolf asked. After the first term wilderness mission, Ashcroft replied. But as a familiar, you're legally part of your witches. You can help anytime. She smiled faintly. That's the advantage of a demon familiar. You know things. Wolf helped dispose of failed potions. Then one final question surfaced. What started the war? What made the Magi so dangerous? Ashcroft's expression hardened instantly. That question must never be asked. Even she didn't know. Before the war, the Magi were reclusive. Hermits. They lived in magical clan cities and avoided outsiders. Then something changed. What? Wolf pressed. That part is either lost or cursed. When the war began, the entire world declared war on them simultaneously. Demons were neutral at first, she added. Very few existed in this world outside of familiar contracts. But by the end, they defected to the Magi's side. That's why demons are shunned. Wolf absorbed that slowly. You could ask a demonic familiar, she added. But summoning seals most of their memories, assuming they existed before being summoned. The implication lingered in the air. Perhaps familiars weren't created by summoning. Perhaps they were called from somewhere else. Professor Ashcroft dismissed the wards. Enough secrets for one day. Dinner awaits your witches. Wolf nodded. The academy suddenly felt smaller. And the world, much larger.